I don't know how sleep gives us our personality. I have seen how daylight creates folds in our shadows. I see how linear nomenclature often uses the habitat of species. Bengalis Munia, Vulpes bengalensis, the Bengal tiger. I would come to accept that the place that gives shape to our spine attaches itself to our name, turning us into a type, a species.
Hello and welcome to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian, where we speak to celebrated authors and emerging literary voices from across South Asia. Today is Thursday, the 16th of May. I'm your host, Shwetha Srikanthan, assistant editor at Himal Southasian, coming to you from Colombo. And here with us today is Sumana Roy, joining us from Siliguri, to talk about her latest book, Provincials, Postcards from the Peripheries. Sumana Roy is a poet, writer, essayist, and editor. She is the author of several published texts, including her latest Provincials, How I Became a Tree, Missing, My Mother's Lover and Other Stories, and 2 poetry collections, Out of Syllabus and VIP, Very Important Plant. In literature, it seems that there might not be any other way to see the province except in contrast to the city. So much has been said about cosmopolitanism, but what of provincialism? Growing up in Siliguri, a sub-Himalayan town in Bengal, Sumana Roy's experiences have marked her understanding of the provincial reader's life, including the sense of belatedness and the desire for pleasure in language. There's a constant search for writings that bring other worlds to the provincial reader's lives, but also for glimpses of lives similar to theirs. In a series of postcards from the peripheries of South Asia and beyond, and ranging from Rabindranath Tagore to Shakespeare, the Bhakti poets to the Brontes, Sumana introduces us to the imaginative worlds of those who have celebrated provinciality. She challenges the dominance of the metropolis to reclaim the dignity of provincial life and challenges the imaginary barriers we tend to put up between the rural and urban. Sumana, welcome to the Southasia Review of Books podcast, and thank you so much for joining us to talk about your excellent new book.
Thank you, Shwetha. I'm very happy to be speaking to you. Also, when you were not just introducing me, which always feels like you're talking about someone else, the way you introduced Provincials, Postcards from the Peripheries, it's almost like I could see a different book. So thank you for this introduction.
Thank you, Sumana. So let's start with defining who a provincial is. In the book, you write that provincials are almost indifferent to their own literature and the immediate ideas, writings, or art that surrounds them. So what inspired you to investigate the idea of the provincial by collecting these postcards of thoughts, practices, and places?
Who is a provincial? Shwetha, that's the question I set out to answer. And that's a question I set out to answer in the hope that others would see it as a question worth investigating, worth their time. Sometimes we ask, and sometimes we need to ask questions, knowing that the book, or the essay, or the talk, or the classroom lecture, or a conversation such as the kind you and I are having, might not necessarily bring us an answer, but that it will set up a path of inquiry. A couple of decades ago, it's been about 20 years, a couple of decades ago I was called a provincial. I thought that I knew it to be a pejorative, and I returned home to Siliguri from a city and rushed to look at the dictionary. I was on an overnight train and had reached Siliguri in the morning. Remember, I'm talking of a time before the smartphone, before dictionary.com became available on the smartphone. And I asked that question to myself, who is a provincial? And what is it that makes me a provincial? So to answer your question, that was the question that set it off. And as is perhaps the gradient or habit of my mind, I began looking at people, both alive and dead, who would have been categorized as provincials. I began to study their behavior, the forces that had created them, nourished them, nurtured them, as well as those that had caused them resistance. And I observed them almost like a parent. The choices they had made, the control they had relinquished, their intellectual and emotional habits, and of course habitats, as you very kindly introduced the book as. I was trying to create a family. I was bringing these people together, these people who were strangers to each other, separated, as you noted, by history and geography, and much else, but who shared perhaps just this, a commonality of origin. So that is how Shakespeare and Rabindranath Tagore and D.H. Lawrence and Kishore Kumar and my father and I and many others like unremarkable people such as myself could come together. So this book is not an answer to the question about who is a provincial, but what are these experiences of provincials like, and what is it that characterizes the provincial character of living and of making art.
Thank you for that, Sumana. So, one of my favorite postcards in the book is the one on searching for the name of your hometown in the books you had read. For example, the letter to the editor you had written to the Telegraph, and the sense of pride and ownership that came from your parents and teachers upon finding the name of the town in this paper. Another postcard further into the book looks at the dearth of reading material in towns and villages in socialist India, which produced two categories of people: those who had stopped reading after school and college, and those who would read anything they could find. So tell us about this and how your experiences of growing up in Siliguri shaped the idea for this book.
It struck me, Shwetha, as I thought of these letters, that someone like Choton, who is on the first or second page of the book, someone like Choton wrote to me when I was in school. I was in school, I was in an English medium school, and he was a school dropout with almost no English at all. And the one sentence he had written in this letter, which he had intended to be a love letter, was, "Don't worry, be happy." It was obviously copied from a song that had been made popular by an Amitabh Bachchan film, or the kind of letters I wrote on behalf of my schoolmates to their boyfriends in the small towns in Bengal and India's northeast. And that is how I might have first begun practicing my writing. My mother, whom you just mentioned, she would make me write letters to my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, who couldn't read English at all, but who would carry the letters I would send him everywhere. He lived in a place called Hili, then a village town, now a small town, on the Indo-Bangladesh border, so a provincial town. And he would carry these letters with him everywhere and show it to whoever came to his shop, and to those, for instance, from whom he would buy vegetables and fish and meat from. My mother would also make me write letters to the editor of the Telegraph newspaper, and very occasionally, when they would be published, and not all of them would be published, as you can imagine, she would preserve them as cuttings. She still has them. She showed me a few of these, I think, last winter, and she said, "These are your earliest writings," without actually perhaps knowing that this is where I had located the origin of literature, and certainly of provincial literature. So that was, the length of her ambition for me, that my name, the name of my school, and the name of my town below it would appear in print. It would please my teachers, as you noted. I still wonder why. What was it about the printed word at that time? The hopefulness and energy in such an unremarkable thing. When I would discover Rabindranath Tagore's letters, Chinnapatro, written to his niece Indira during his stay on and by the river Padma, or Podda as we say in Bangla, and read what he would say about them later, that it was in these letters that he first got to practice his writing, the short story and the novella, and also possibly the poem. It would all begin to fall into place. My letter writing habits, written to people I did not know, for instance, to Poritosh, to my friend Jonaki's boyfriend at that time, and so on, that it would gradually begin to seep into my consciousness that literature derived from litera, meaning letter, and that it applied to so many provincial writers, not just those who would use the postcard and the inland letter as their green room, like, for instance, Tagore had, or like I thought I was doing, for lack of opportunity for me at that time, but also those, so many of my friends, who would never publish a book or an essay or a poem, that a letter was accommodative in the best possible way. The form or the format of the letter, as you would acknowledge, Shwetha, allows all, at least allowed then, because we've forgotten letter writing as an art form that derived so deeply and richly from the everydayness of life, that the letter, the inland letter, the postcard, they allowed all forms of writing, and literature and literary history would have been born from these first telegrams sent out to the world, a form of writing where we were aware of who our reader was. So when I'm making this connection in the book, I move from my letter writing habits, the letter writing habits of my friends, to, for instance, Rabindranath and Chinnapatro. Let me just focus on three aspects: the letter, the post office, and the postmaster. And they're very important tropes in Rabindranath's consciousness, but also, as you've read the book, in Bhuvaneshwar, the Hindi writer, who writes a story about a person who's a professional letter writer, as it were, writing letters for other people. But to return to Rabindranath, in Dagghar, little Amol, the little boy Amol, waits to hear from the king he has written to. In another story about the postmaster, about which I've written in this book, the girl who has come to love the young postmaster cannot even wait for a letter to come from him, unlike Amol. It's because she's illiterate after all, and also for all real purposes without an address. So, Rabindranath, because he is Rabindranath, is aware of the spiritual energy of the letter and its effect on both the letter writer and the letter receiver, and he tries to import that energy to his writing, no matter which genre he's moving through. It's something that many of us writing letters from the provinces might have felt intuitively, but did not have the spiritual intelligence to articulate to ourselves. So in Rabindranath's story, the postmaster is young. He has been posted to a village of no consequence, and a village where its residents, at least he thinks the residents were anyway unfit to mix with genteel people. And it's a telling description. The fact of it being outside the realm of description. This is what the postmaster thinks of this particular province. But how does what is the relationship between the postmaster and the province? So you see, Rabindranath is gesturing through his own practice towards the habitat of literature, being in this invisible and, very importantly, at least for someone like me, in this invisible and inconsequential places. So he's rejecting the spectacular, he's rejecting important events, and in doing so is committing to a literary modernism that owes to and derives from the provincial. We encounter something new, a shy place, places that were once shy, like the small town, my hometown from where I'm speaking to you, a shyness of place that abets this aesthetic. One last point about this which I'd like to add is this Stan Kal Patra, the place-time character trinity, that is at the heart of the understanding of the story, of the short story, of fiction in most Indian literary cultures. It is first given form to in the letter. So you see, all of us, when we were taught how to write letters, we would write the date, so that's Kal, and place, that's Stan, from where the letter is being written. And it's a giveaway that the writer, when they migrate, for instance, whether it's Rabindranath or people such as myself, far less talented and unremarkable, when they migrate from the amateur space of the letter to the story, we have to find a way to bring to life something like turning information into literary muscle. And Rabindranath is aware of this migration from letter to literature.
Thank you, Sumana. In the book, you talk about how your family moved from a border town near Bangladesh, and your grandfather, an East Bengali who moved to India just before independence, and to borrow your words, had been able to give up everything to East Pakistan, later Bangladesh, everything except his accent and his dialect. Could you tell us about your relationship to the language of Bangla, with its many dialects in Bengal and Bangladesh, and also on pronunciation, which was another favorite part of the book for me, where you unpack how English as a language of contact marks many provincials who were writing mainly in the languages they had grown up speaking.
Thank you, Shwetha, for noticing this. That is perhaps also the most heartfelt section of the book for me. My paternal grandparents, who are no longer alive, they had to move from Bangladesh 5 days before Indian independence. And their first two children were born there. So they moved to India, which they always pronounced as if it were a thing that could be mentioned only in scare quotes. I can almost hear the sound of my grandmother, my Dida, saying India in a way as if it elicited both awe and fear and so many other emotions. I almost heard her voice in my ear as I'm speaking to you. So my paternal grandparents, as you noticed, they carried their bodies to this new country, but also their habits of eating and sleeping and speaking with them like everyone's did, like everyone had to. So they spoke in a Bangla, they spoke in a language that the Calcutta categorizing machine characterizes as Bangal, overlooking the fact that there are multiple dialects that derive from regions in Bangladesh itself, say from Sylhet and Chittagong and Pabna and so on. So like many of my friends here in northern Bengal, my father's family lived in two Banglas. The language at home, which I think was a baggy language, and I say this from having heard them speak and from having heard them laugh in the language, and the Bangla of examinations and application letters and bureaucratic forms. It must have been undermining to be made to feel that the mother tongue, their mother's tongue, wasn't adequate or polished enough for the world. I would gradually begin to notice this as I grew older. I noticed how little my uncles and aunts spoke when we had visitors from outside the family. They didn't want to mispronounce or say anything that would give away their class background. It might have been the first time I noticed how the provincial was actually a class category. The same thing would happen to my English pronunciation, Shwetha. I often mispronounce English words. It is not only because of what linguists call RP, or received pronunciation, but also because I've only met these words in a book, not heard them being used. It's a joke, I think, or at least should be, shouldn't it, Shweta, that accents which bear the mark of the places we come from and our pronunciation, which is a bearer of our history, a history of moving in and into language, that it should be used to mock us and to determine our socio-economic class background, that it's practiced by people like writers and academics who say all the politically correct things in the classroom and in their books and tweets is a shame, really. But even all this knowledge isn't enough to deal with the kind of nervousness I, or people like me, feel. You know, Shweta, just before this podcast, maybe an hour or so before we began recording this, I called a close friend to ask how to pronounce two particular words, just so that I don't make a mistake during the podcast. But I know I will if I have to pronounce those words again. If they come up during our conversation and so on. And so when I was reading Annie Ernaux's book about her father and how his accent and mispronunciation was often mocked at by city-goers, by people in the city, not city-goers, sorry. It spoke to me very, very deeply. And people notice many things when they read literary texts. These are some of the things that I happen to notice.
Thank you so much, Sumana. That was really touching, and that's something I think a lot of us across South Asia can relate to on a very personal level. Before we welcome you to read an excerpt from the book, I'd like to take a moment to invite our listeners to check out our Patreon program to support Himal's in-depth independent coverage, including some of the most wide-ranging book reviews from around the region that relies on the support of our listeners. South Asia Review of Books is a podcast and a monthly newsletter that threads together our latest reviews and literary interviews. You'll find a special reading list curated by Sumana Roy in this month's edition, so do sign up for the newsletter to keep up with our latest reviews, podcasts, and more. Now, Sumana, over to you to read an excerpt from Provincials.
I'm reading the last section from the first section of the book, which is the preface. From plants, I have learned the effects of etiolation. I have lived among an etiolated people. Perhaps that is why I only notice the background dancers. That is why I only think of those who have been pushed into the anonymity of etc. How they are called details in a painting, not noticed unless one peers closer. I don't know how sleep gives us our personality. I have seen how daylight creates folds in our shadows. I see how linear nomenclature often uses the habitat of species, Bengalis munia, vulpes bengalensis, the Bengal tiger. I would come to accept that the place that gives shape to our spine attaches itself to our name, turning us into a type, a species. I discover that there's a style of furniture called provincial. I read Robin Longworm's letter from Shillong to his student in a city. I'm still a provincial sonneteer at heart. My eyes pursue the perimeter. When a leaf begins to dry, it is the edges that start curling first. This book is a history of those curls.
Thank you for that reading, Sumana. We touched on letters earlier, and this is a huge part of the book, from unpacking the culture of giving cards, sending and receiving letters from your family, including the love letters in English, and also Tagore's short story, The Postmaster, which you talked about earlier. So could you talk a little bit more about how you use letters to discuss narratives of power, particularly the moments where English made people feel like an equal?
Thank you for noticing that, because we just discussed pronunciation and accent. I think one of the things that the letter allowed people like me to do was to hide behind the written word, or hide, I would say, in the written word, Shwetha, where the accent and pronunciation are not audible. So if I could get my grammar right, my father, who spoke in English, would sound quote-unquote rustic, as Panierner's father's French did to her, has almost perfect English grammar. He studied in a Bangla medium school that placed a lot of emphasis on getting both Bangla grammar and English grammar right. So it was from him that I kind of got my grammar, as it were. So I just remember that there was something about the charisma of the English language that made people like my grandfather, for instance, and I've written about this elsewhere, perhaps not in this book, where my grandfather identified the English language, which he did not understand at all, with a kind of song. So he would say, for instance, shy Ingreji. Shy is the onomatopoeia for the sound of the blustery winds. So something that can cause trees to lose their heads, that can cause madness in nature, as it were, in the natural world. So that kind of power. And To write letters to people without expecting a reply in that language is something that I begin to notice as an urge related as much to the literary as it is to my understanding of the living. I perhaps derive my definition of what constitutes the living from the scientist, the botanist and physicist Jagadish Chandra Bose, for whom response was the defining characteristic of the living. Anything that could respond was living. He was able to prove that plants were living beings because plants responded. I was writing to a people who would not be able to respond in the language, in the vocabulary that I was writing to them in. Think of Ocean Vuong's book, an epistolary novel, On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous, written to a mother who would not be able to read it in the language in which he is writing these letters. So the power of the English language there, the power in it, as Vuong tells us or shows us through his writing, of being able to hold a history that might not otherwise be visible, in our cases audible, to a people who do not know these other languages, is perhaps the reason that so many of us gravitated towards writing in English, not because could these red letters that I wrote, had they been preserved? They've not been preserved. My parents, like most South Asians, have no inbuilt sense of history, at least not the kind of history of archiving or chronicling that comes to us, say, from an European sense of history. So all of these are lost, and most of these are my parents' love letters to each other. My father writing to them from Balurghat Hilly, from the Indo-Bangladesh border, to my mother, who was still a student in Calcutta, and later on to Shantiniketan, where her parents were. So this exchange of letters, that survives. But the fact of the letter being a very important archive. Shwetha, I think, though you are very, very young, if you spoke to your parents or grandparents or to people of that generation, some of the only things that they would read in their life, because reading material was so expensive, was beyond the means of so many people, were just letters. I remember feeling the deprivation of reading material. In this small town, there were no bookstores, of course, but also my parents, in a socialist India, even if there had been bookstores, wouldn't have had the money to buy us quote-unquote storybooks. So we read the same borrowed books over and over again. I read those old and stale newspapers in which the vegetables would arrive, would come packed, or in which my parents would buy me jhalmuri. So the idea of the reading material in Southasia, which you bring up, and which I touch upon in the section on the provincial reader, but always, like news, like information, reading material often arrived to us after they had expired as news or information in a different world. That sense of belatedness marked our reading and our writing habits as well.
Thank you for that, Sumana. I really like what you said there, because after reading Provincials, I did go to my mother and I asked her, because there was a dearth of reading material where she grew up as well, and she agreed there was a hunger to read whatever was accessible, whether that was scraps of paper she would find, road signs, anything. And it's such a universal experience, I think, and you've written about it so beautifully in this book.
That also, Shwetha, if you speak to your mother about this again, I think she would tell you that also affected or impacted our reading habits. We would just not become readers, we would become rereaders. We would be reading the same thing over and over again because of this deprivation, of this cultural deprivation. And that would make us the readers we are today. So if you say something, I would listen to you and then play what you've said in my head once more, instead of, for instance, the kind of response someone like my nephew or niece growing up in a very different setting, even in this provincial town now, but in a post-internet, post-globalized provincial town, would respond. So there is a difference between, for instance, your mother's, we share a similar generation, your mother and I, and for instance, you and mine, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And another interesting thing that she told me, there was also, like you said, there was a lack of writing material at the time she was growing up. So she was also a rewriter in that she would write letters or anything in pencil and she would erase all of it and rewrite again on those pieces of paper. All this writing was also temporary for her in that she had to keep reusing these materials. So that was also very interesting to hear.
I'm so glad we had this conversation with her. Absolutely, it would make us some kind of writer, and that is why, I wanted to identify the provincial writer in this particular mode, because, when I would first encounter Picasso and Matisse and their work, and I would discover that even on an old canvas, Matisse, for instance, when he would paint over something that he had drawn before, and traces or remainders of that would stay behind in this new work of art, and how that itself became part of that aesthetic, as if the older work of art was a code or that had become a remainder. So the kind of writing practice that your mother mentions, and which I also have experienced or been compelled to do, made an older kind of writing a trace or a quote, even if in a humorous or moving manner, it would stay behind, as if nothing could be a tabula rasa in that sense. That too is the provincial aesthetic. I'm so glad to hear from you about your mother's experience. Thank you.
And thank you. You've given us so much to think about with this book. And that also brings me to my last question of the episode. One of the questions you get asked about often is whether you would have been able to write your 2017 book, How I Became a Tree, had you not spent most of your life in the Himalayan foothills. In Provincials, you give us a curation of writing that explores this binary between the city and the countryside. So could you tell us about how Provincials have been imagined in these works, and also share your recommendations of some of your favorite writings from the South Asian provinces?
Thank you for asking me this question, honestly. A friend with whom I've discussed this once told me that you should write an essay which has the title, I'm not a nature writer. But yeah, I'll come to that some other time, not here. Shwetha, just a little while ago, going to Facebook, making the kind of journey we navigate a few times every day now, I found a post about the Duars, the region in northern Bengal adjacent to where I'm speaking to you from. This person had shared a few photos of himself with family and friends. The caption in Bangla, when translated, said, "My Duars, my Aranya," or "My Duars, my forest." Now, it ought to have made me happy to see that there was still a few trees left in the Gorumara forest, given the rate at which trees are being cut where I am. But I will confess, Shwetha, that I felt a bit annoyed. But outsiders will not understand this annoyance. And there is a history here, both personal and collective. Right from my childhood till now, when someone discovers that I am from Siliguri, there is only one response. How fortunate I am to be here among its trees and near the mountains and so on. It's a stereotype of the writer in the Indian provinces, particularly of the kind of place I come from. And stereotypes flatten, and it does the same of the provincial. The provincial writer need not be a nature writer. I can't say whether I would have written How I Became a Tree if I had lived elsewhere. I certainly couldn't have written it if I was living on the moon. Just as I can't say whether I would have been the same person had I been born to a different set of parents. It annoys me, this expectation of the provincial writer in India to take naturally to this category called nature writing. The city writer can write about anything, just as the European writer can in any form. So Jacinta Kerketa and Mahadev Topo, among many others who I've mentioned in the book, including, of course, Mahasweta Devi, and many, many others, they resist and in fact attack this expectation of the provincial writer being a supplier of cliches to do with how beautiful nature is, for instance, by showing reality for what it is. That the provinces that we're living in at this moment, it's a new landscape that is being tortured and denuded for what the harassers are calling development. This too, I hope, Shwetha, is recorded as part of our provincial history. You've asked me to share with you a few recommendations. I'll just share with you a few favorites. One is, of course, R.K. Narayan's Malguri Days. Who doesn't love to read about Malguri and everything that is happening there? The way that every day is shown to us as a thing of wonder, how it is rejecting of spectacle and the spectacular. I love that. In this sense, I'm also thinking of Vibhuti Bhushan's Pather Pachali, set in the Indian provinces, in the Bengali provinces. Ruskin Bond's stories set in the Doon Valley. Then Mahasweta Devi's stories of a people in the neglected forest provinces of India. Then writing from India's northeast, not in the sense that northeast writing is marketed today, because I don't believe that there is a school of northeast writing, but of writers who are writing both in English and in the languages of the region from India's northeast. Really wonderful writing there. One more I'd like to share with you, and it's a personal one, so forgive me for being indulgent here. Writers from North Bengal, from where I'm speaking to you, where I live or at least try to live, particularly our poets writing in Bangla, in its various languages and dialects in northern Bengal. Writers writing in Bangla, in Rajbungs, in Kamtapuri, in Nepali, and various other dialects of Bangla. Not a single one of them, Shwetha, is to be found in the Calcutta selected literature that Bengalis study as Bangla literature in school and university. So I hope people listening to us today would seek out some of these writers, and in the newsletter that you mentioned, I'll mention a few of them, of course. And in the end, to think of how outsiders look at the province and provincials, Upamanyu Chatterjee's English August, and U.R. Ananthamurthy's long short story, Bara. So English writing from India has had an interesting new life because of many provincial writers like Hindi cinema has, and I've written about some of them in Provincials, and I hope our listeners and readers, if they choose to read Provincials, would not only read these books, but also choose to write about their own provincial lives and the character of their lives, and the literature and art and music and cinema they like or dislike. That is the reason I wrote this book, Shwetha, so that it inaugurates a new line of inquiry into provincial experience and gives us possibly a different history of how modernity came to be created.
Thank you, Sumana. And reading Provincials, there's so much we can take away from the book, including an amazing reading list that we can keep going back to. So thank you again for an excellent discussion and for taking the time to speak with us today. It was a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Shwetha. I really enjoyed speaking to you, and the email conversation we've had before as well. Thank you for that.
Thank you for listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian. If you like this episode, please share widely, rate, review, subscribe, and download the show on your favorite podcast apps. You can find Sumana Roy's reading list for the episode in this month's Southasia Review of Books newsletter. You can find the links to subscribe and listen to previous episodes on our website at himalmag.com. Thanks again, and until next time.